Okay. Great. No, oh no. Now I have to, sorry, it won't let me click the recording button. Okay. Okay. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so hello, and firstly, thank you all for being here. And also thank you to Sam for organising such a wonderful project. So I think we can all agree that Romancing the Gothic is one of the best things to come out of Gothic studies in recent years. And I'm really delighted to be here with you all today. So my talk is going to be focusing on exploring anti-Semitism in Gothic and horror. And this is obviously a lot to cover, and I have packed in quite a lot. So some of the discussion is going to be broad brushstrokes, but what I hope you'll get out of this is a sense of the connections between the Jewish experience and horror throughout history, and some of the ways that this has developed and evolved in Gothic and horror narratives. I also want to give a content warning now that there will be discussions of anti-Semitism, including talk and images of anti-Jewish violence and discrimination. I will try and flag this when it comes up in the talk, when it's particularly violent, but if you do need to, feel free to step away from the talk at any point and come back. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with the image on my title slide here, which is a drawing of a dybbuk by Jewish artist Ephraim Moshe Lillian. So within Jewish mythology, the dybbuk is a possessing ghost or the dislocated soul of a dead person. And in Hebrew, the name dybbuk means a case of attachment, or to adhere or to cling. And this is essentially what the ghost does. It clings or attaches itself to a host body and acts like a demon or a poltergeist until they have either completed their unfinished business or they have been exorcised. And what I want to suggest is that we can use this image of attachment to view the connection between Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism, and also the relationship between Jewish history and horror, where the horrors of anti-Semitism are not a welcome presence, but something that has attached itself to Jewish communities throughout history and continues to cling on to today. So this talk is going to be divided into 4 parts. And part 1 will explore some historical horrors, focusing in particular on Britain and the events leading up to Jewish expulsion from the country in 1290. We'll then skip forward to the 18th and 19th centuries to explore how the legacy of this history impacted the rise and development of Gothic literature. And these first 2 parts come out of my PhD research. The final 2 parts of the talk will move to focus on to horror films, with part 3 focusing on early 20th century horror, and the final part devoted to the recent rise of specifically Jewish horror cinema. So this is part of my new project that I'm working on at the moment, and I'm really excited to be able to share this with some of this with you today. So before we get started, I think it would actually be helpful to define some terms. So firstly, what is anti-Semitism? The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism states that anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. It also includes a set of guidelines that provide more clarity, and I won't quote them here, but if you are interested, you can find the full text on their website. So this definition was developed by a group of scholars in the fields of Holocaust history, Jewish studies, and Middle East studies. And it responds to and builds upon the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition, which is itself described as a working definition. So there is ongoing conversation and debate within Jewish communities and Jewish studies regarding the exact definition of anti-Semitism, particularly in relation to Zionism and anti-Zionism. But for this talk, I think what is important to highlight is that this form of prejudice includes both racist and religious persecution of a specific group or people believed to be part of a specific group. So this includes discrimination against ethnic, religious, and or secular Jews. So secondly, I also want to highlight the term Judeo-Christian. Perhaps you've come across this term before, and perhaps you have wondered whether or not you should be using it. And I want to say that the short answer is no, because TLDR, Judeo-Christian is not really a thing. As a term, Judeo-Christian is essentially an American invention from the early 20th century, and it's particularly tied to American politics, Christian nationalism, and supersessionism. So what is supersessionism, you might ask? Basically, it's a Christian theology that argues that Christians and the Christian church have superseded Jews as God's chosen people, and that the new covenant brought in by the Christian Messiah has superseded or replaced the former covenant that was exclusive to Jews. So obviously, rabbinic Judaism rejects supersessionism. So quickly, as Stephen M. Feldman has argued, once one recognizes that Christianity has historically engendered anti-Semitism, that this so-called tradition, then this so-called tradition appears as dangerous Christian dogma, at least from a Jewish perspective. For Christians, the concept of a Judeo-Christian tradition comfortably suggests that Judaism progresses into Christianity, that Judaism is somehow completed in Christianity. The concept of a Judeo-Christian tradition flows from the Christian theology of supersessionism. More recently, Rabbi Daniel Rottenberg has pointed out several issues with the term, including that it positions Jews and Christians against Muslims, and also that it further erases thousands of years of Christian anti-Semitism, including violence perpetrated by Christians against Jews. So while this term is often used to point out the similarities between Christianity and Judaism, and yes, there are similarities between all three major Abrahamic religions, it fails to fully acknowledge the differences of these religious traditions and the fact that since the divergence of Judaism and Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Judaism has continued to evolve and develop. So as Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz writes, Judaism is Judaism because it rejects Christianity, and Christianity is Christianity because it rejects Judaism. So, however, while acknowledging the differences between these two traditions and rejecting the term Judeo-Christian, there are many periods in history in which these communities do interact. And I think the image of the book is really useful here. We can consider, for example, the ways that narratives of Judeo-Christianity are imposed upon Judaism, but always in order to promote and legitimize Christian narratives. We can also think about the ways that Christian anti-Semitism in particular often attaches to and clings on to Jewish narratives and histories, so that yes, there is a shared history, but it is one in which these groups are often on very different sides. Which brings us finally to part 1. So the history of anti-Semitism is like a horror story, or rather, it's like an ongoing multi-part horror story with chapters that are unfortunately still being written. In this part, we're going to focus on the theological foundations of anti-Semitism within Christianity and some of the ways that this manifested within the medieval period through the construction of a monstrous Jewish other and tales of terror. These theological and medieval narratives form the foundation of anti-Semitic traditions and narratives in later periods, including the rise of the Gothic in the 18th and 19th centuries, and also the emergence of Nazism in the 20th century. And to reiterate, this part comes with a big content warning, as we'll be discussing a lot of violent history, including depictions of violence towards children and child deaths, as well as violence enacted towards Jews. So first, what does the Bible say? Or more specifically, the New Testaments, which is the collection of religious texts that form the foundation of Christianity. So here we'll find narrative threads that place blame for the violent crucifixion of the Christian Messiah at the collective feet of the Jewish community. So we can look to John 5:18, which states that Jews sought to kill Jesus. We can also find supernatural claims that associate Jews with devils. So such stories construct an imagined Jewish other who is a fictional representation conjured within Christian imagination. And I think it's really important to note that this isn't Jewish self-representation, and that within these stories, Jewish others are conjured in order to promote a specific narrative, which often results in anti-Jewish prejudice. So again, if we look to the Gospel of John, and specifically chapter 8, verses 44 to 45, so this verse relates an episode where Jesus declares during a hostile exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Yet, because I tell the truth, you do not believe me." This exchange has since been interpreted as Jesus addressing Jews collectively, and it contains several tropes that are still found within anti-Semitic narratives today. These tropes include framing the imagined Jewish other as Satan's offspring, as Satan's conspiratorial ally or agent, and as sharing his infernal desires and predisposition to lie. The Gospel of John also unmistakably transforms an identifiable ethnic group into a symbol of evil, and as Elaine Pagels has observed, this decision brings with it religious, social, and political implications. So re-establishing the narrative portrayed in the New Testaments from one of intra-community conflict, so that is Jews debating amongst themselves, into one of inter-community conflict, which is basically Jews versus the emerging Christians, the Jewish community was increasingly placed alongside the devil as evil, demonic, and other, in contrast to Christians. The book of Revelation too continues to connect Jews with Satan and ideas of demonic duplicity. And Revelation 2:9, for example, explicitly proclaims that I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. So in the early days of Christianity, Jews were increasingly exploited as a devilish foil. But the continued existence of Jewish communities complicated matters for Christian ideology that paradoxically needed to supersede the religious claims of Judaism, while also depending on Jewish history to affirm its own theological claims. So again, think about the Dybbuk here. However, as a theological abstraction, the imagined Jew proved a useful figure in medieval Christian thought, onto which formulations of difference could be explored and against which boundaries of Christian identities solidified. So in the medieval period, one of the key fictional narratives into which the imagined monstrous Jew was placed was stories of blood libel, which includes stories of host desecration libel and ritual murder libel. Again, I want to highlight these stories are fictional, but they're very violent. And as a warning, you may find some of the images I'll be showing distressing. So first, what is blood libel? So basically, these are stories that accuse Jewish communities of kidnapping Christian children to use their blood for rituals. There are several variations of these stories that all essentially have at their core the idea that Jewish religious practices are in actuality cult and demonic rituals, drawing on theological ties that connect Jews with the devil, and also that Jews are a threat to Christian communities and especially children. So in some stories, Jewish communities are involved with well poisoning, and this links the imagined monstrous Jews with ideas of disease. Some stories depict, often in quite a lot of detail, the torture and ritual murder of children in a way that typically resembles the Christian story of the crucifixion. So if we think of the way that within the Gospel of John, the Jewish community is blamed for the death of the Christian Messiah, blood libel stories reenact this murder in a way that seems to establish the guilt of this community. So moreover, transforming the victim from Jesus to a young, innocent, and typically male child emphasizes the apparent threat that this community poses to a Christian nation. And we can think of this as being a mix between the Simpsons' Think of the Children meme and more recently the insidious Pizzagate conspiracy that again plays into adult fears of a global paedophile network. And yes, QAnon and Pizzagate conspiracy theories are just a more recent iteration of blood libel. Another aspect of blood libel is host desecration. So within Catholicism, the host is the wafer which is used within the Eucharist. And it's transformed through transubstantiation into the literal body of Christ. So within blood libel stories, Jews are accused of stealing the host and, like the children in other stories, of torturing the body and making it bleed in order to use the blood in rituals. You might be thinking, why did these stories come about? And the answer lies partly in economics, but also in the scapegoating of the Jewish community for economic ills and perceived societal unfairness. So one of the few occupations permitted to the real Jewish community in England was money lending or usury. W.D. Rubenstein writes that the presence of Jews in medieval England had only one purpose, and that was to act as money lenders to the king and as what Cecil Roth has termed treasury agents. Fulfilling the role of treasury agent, Jewish money lenders were thus viewed as agents of the state, but concurrently separate from it. And Rubenstein further notes that popular odium at the burden of tax collection tax collection and interest payments was always directed at a hereditary race of outcasts and Christ killers, rather than at the king or his circle for whom these monies were chiefly collected. So the monstrous possibilities of the imagined Jews soon reflected this aversion, especially within superstitious myths of medieval libels, in which associations with Satan were interwoven with accusations of murder, blasphemous cannibalism, and vampirism. And on the screen, for anyone who doesn't recognize the photo, you can see an image of probably the most infamous Jewish moneylender there is, Shylock. This is a still taken from the 2004 film version of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And I won't go into too much detail about Shylock today. Do feel free to ask me any questions about him though. But I do want to note that though it was written in the Jacobean period, which is a little bit after the medieval period, we can still see the vestiges of blood libel. So while Shylock's victims are not children, he does require a pound of Christian flesh as payment for his monetary bond. But to return to the original blood libel stories, Jules Zanger highlights that blood libel essentially had both literal and figurative dimensions, as it transforms the notion that Jews were financial parasites, draining the wealth of England, into the idea that they were also literally consuming Britain's flesh and blood. So the first recorded case of blood libel in Britain was published in 1173, and it tells the story of William of Norwich. This came in the form of a hagiography, which is essentially a specific type of biography detailing the story of a saint, because a key part of blood libel stories is venerating the victims. So the life and miracle of St. William of Norwich was written by Benedictine monk Thomas of Monmouth. I'm not going to quote from it here because it's really quite horrific to read, but you can get a sense of the story from this picture. And this work helped to popularise and propagate blood libel allegations within Britain. And as you can see, the painting was created in the 15th century, so their popularity was quite long lasting. In the following century, and echoing William's tale, blood libel was invoked again with the story of another child, Hugh, whose death is alleged to be equally bloody and violent. Cults of martyrdom flourished around these stories. William and Hugh were both revered as local saints, although they were never officially canonized. And Hugh was even venerated in the ballad St. Hugh, which was incredibly popular for centuries. And a version even featured in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So on screen, you can see an excerpt from Chaucer's Prioress's Tale, which reads, "O young Hugh of Lincoln, slain also by cursed Jews, as it is well known, for it is but a little while ago." These stories did not end with William and Hugh, and across Europe you can find similar iterations. As I've mentioned, these stories typically parody accusations that Jews were Christ killers, and similarly, the body politic of Britain was personified as a young, innocent child who was being devoured by the vampiric or cannibalistic imagined Jew. So although the word vampire never appears in these stories, they can be considered in the term of metaphorical vampirism that imagines literal acts of parasitic consumption. Speculation surrounding the imagined uses of Christian blood, for example, includes the consumption of blood, while the host desecration libel cultivated cannibalistic ideas that Jews were consuming the flesh of the Christian Messiah. It was also believed that Jewish communities baked blood from their Christian victims into Passover matzah or Purim cakes, as well as using it as an aphrodisiac. And perhaps the most weird myth that the blood libel fueled is the myth of Jewish male menses, as Christian polemicists actually argued that only Christian blood could replace and stem the monthly blood loss of menstruating Jewish men. So in such superstitious accounts then, the body and blood of Christians, whether that be Christian children or the transubstantiated flesh of the Christian Messiah, is threatened by Jewish practices that are portrayed as evil, murderous, and vampiric. So, of course, the falsity of blood libel should be clear, not least because such myths ignore, misinterpret, and contradict the biblical declaration that the blood is the life, which you can see on screen. These directives function as a prohibition against eating or drinking blood. However, stories of blood libel provided a convenient scapegoat within Britain, and for Jewish communities of Britain, the consequences of blood libel were incredibly violent. To return to the image of the Dybbuk, we can think about blood libel myths as possessing spirits that attach onto Jewish communities and inflict harm. One of the worst examples of the consequences of blood libel is the York pogrom of 1190, which was one of many massacres that took place across England from 1189 to 1190. Jewish communities were attacked at Clifford's Tower in York, and about 150 Jewish people, including men, women, and children, were killed during a violent siege. So ultimately, this centuries-long anti-Jewish persecution concluded with the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290. Things were not much better in Europe, as blood libel stories were similarly propagated, and Spain even went so far as to set up the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, or the Spanish Inquisition for short, which was essentially set up to identify, convert and imprison or expel or murder heretics and secret Jews. So to sum up, what parts of the New Testament laid the foundation for a Christian theology in which Jews are considered to be monstrous others in league with Satan, medieval myths of blood libel popularized stories of Jewish communities kidnapping, torturing, and murdering Christian children as part of their black masses, devilish deals, and Satan worship. These stories continue to play a part in Britain's literary, cultural, and theological landscapes post-expulsion in 1290. Although not all Jews were expelled, and many avoided expulsion by converting to Christianity, Jewish communities that remained were largely absent in Britain following this expulsion. Nonetheless, the figure of the imagined Jew endured in Britain's popular consciousness, which brings us to our next section, the rise of the Gothic and the readmission of Jews to England. So, Jews were informally readmitted into Britain in 1656 under the Cromwellian Protectorate. Though Britain's Jewish population remained relatively small in the 18th and 19th centuries, the late 18th century witnessed a small but significant rise in Jewish immigration. And this trend continued into the following century. Such immigration was typically centered within Britain's cities, and Todd M. Endelman notes that London in particular was a major center of urban Jewish life. While during the French Revolution, more Jews lived in London than in any other European city except Amsterdam. British society was captured by Jewish questions, and W.D. Rubenstein also highlights that while Jews should have been a relatively insignificant minority, they were afforded a significant prevalence and overrepresentation within the literature of this period. Some of this representation falls into conventional anti-Semitic traditions, where established tropes are repeated and revised, while some also falls into a new trend of toleration or philo-Semitism, which, though operating in a different way to anti-Semitism, is itself considered to be a form of anti-Semitism. So part of this literary representation occurred within the Gothic. So since its inception in 1765 with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, the Gothic has been filled with dark tales of gloomy monasteries, evil monks and nuns, and the odd devil. One such novel is Matthew Lewis's 1796 novel The Monk, which propelled the then 19-year-old Member of Parliament into notoriety. The Monk was immediately surrounded by scandal, as it was criticised for being pornographic and blasphemous, resulting in the novel even being debated in Parliament. The main narrative strand of this text focuses primarily on the monk Ambrosio, as he is tempted into a satanic transgression by a woman, or perhaps a demon, I'm still on the fence about that, named Matilda, who has pretended to be a male novice monk in order to gain access to him. There is also a secondary plot which features the love story between Raymond and Agnes. Notably, alongside its devils, evil monks and nuns, and heroines in distress, there are several Jewish characters. So as Matilda begins to unravel some of her deceptions to Ambrosio, she reveals that not only had she been pretending to be a man, but that she had secretly had a painting taken in the style of a Madonna and surreptitiously made sure that Ambrosio was in possession of this painting. Key to this deception is a Jewish character, and Matilda states that, "I sent it to the Capuchin Abbey as if for sale, and the Jew from who you bought it was one of my emissaries." This seemingly minor revelation appears even more nefarious when we consider the discovery at the novel's conclusion that Matilda has been an agent of the devil, and conjures old Christian conspiracies that Jews are also conspiratorial allies of the devil. There is, of course, another notable Jewish character within this novel, and that is the Wandering Jew. So appearing in the secondary narrative of Raymond and Agnes, this figure briefly wanders into the narrative to help exorcise the ghost of the bleeding nun. Because I guess who else would you want to exorcise those pesky ghosts that just won't stop haunting you? He then swiftly wanders out. So though brief, this episode was praised by Samuel Taylor Coleridge as being a great vigour of fancy. And it's really influential in introducing the Wandering Jew into British Gothic literature. Who is the Wandering Jew, you might ask? Well, the myth of the Wandering Jew emerges in Europe during the medieval period and essentially functions as a story that substantiates the Christian narrative. During the crucifixion, this figure is said to have insulted Jesus and was therefore punished by him to eternally wander the world until the second coming and the end times. So he functions as an eyewitness to key Christian events and claims. He's also a figure who embodies Jewish guilt for the crucifixion, and he's a symbol of the awaited end time, so he also encompasses a lot of apocalyptic anxieties. One key feature of Lewis's Wandering Jew is the addition of a burning cross in the middle of his forehead, which you might be able to make out in the image on screen, which is an image from the novel. So this burning cross is a distinct and unique version of the Mark of Cain that not only manages to horrify the ghost of the bleeding nun, but further marks the Wandering Jew as a singular and alienated being. So through this mark, Lewis introduces a distinctly Gothic version of the Wandering Jew into British literature, and he had many, many imitators. These include Percy Bysshe Shelley, who incorporated the distinctive mark into some of his many, many versions of the Wandering Jew, and also Charles Maturin, who includes an allusion to the mark of Cain in his 1820 Gothic novel Melmoth the Wanderer, in relation to his own eponymous Faustian wanderer, Melmoth. And as I said, some parts of this talk will be broad brushstrokes. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit now to the end of the 19th century and briefly mention a novel that I hope you're all familiar with, and that is Bram Stoker's Dracula. So like the 1790s, the 1890s was a period of increasing Jewish immigration. And consequently, much of Britain was filled with anti-Semitic fears and anxieties, while Jewish questions and established anti-Semitic traditions and trends were revived as Jewish communities were blamed for economic ills, disease, and social decline. The Jewish identification of Dracula within Dracula scholarship is not new, and he's frequently perceived as being ethnically Jewish or an Eastern European other, and fashioned as a version of the Wandering Jew himself. So physically, for example, Dracula is pale, possessing a thin aquiline hooked nose and sharp teeth, which are perfect for drinking the blood of his victims. So like the Jewish other of blood libel myths, Dracula threatens the body politic of Britain as he drinks the blood of the nation's women. He also brings with him infection and contamination, as well as damnation and an association with the satanic. And like the stories of blood libel, he is shown kidnapping young children in order to feed his vampiric brides. He also sleeps surrounded by money in a coffin filled with soil from his native land that smells distinctly of Old Jerusalem. And when he is shot, he bleeds not blood, but money. So Dracula then functions as a response to Christian fear of the foreign other, but also as a medium through which the figurative and literal dimensions of blood libel, in associating blood with money and the consumption of blood as a devilish act, are updated and reimagined. Importantly, these aspects are all the more insidious because the anti-Semitism is not explicit, but lurks just below the surface. So you might not be able to recognize it on the actual surface of the text. So in the next part of the talk, we'll be turning to horror cinema. But for now, I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute comfort break. So it is 10:35. So if we come back at, I guess, 10:40, and we'll resume with horror film. Sounds good? Okay. Okay, so the second half of this talk is going to focus on horror cinema. At the end of the 19th century, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a novel filled with technological advances, looked forward to even more. And in just a few decades later, in 1922, a version of his vampiric count was caught on film. So, directed by F.W. Murnau, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horrors, is a silent German expressionist film, and also an unauthorized and unofficial adaptation of Stoker's novel. Due to attempts to avoid copyright infringement, several aspects of the novel are changed, including the name of the Count from Dracula to Count Orlok. But one thing that remains unchanged is an undercurrent of anti-Semitism that runs through both book and film, and that centers on the depiction of their vampiric counts. So like the novel, the portrayal of the vampire in this film draws on anti-Semitic stereotypes. Count Orlok is physically depicted as having a hooked nose and long claw-like fingernails. His features are also similar to rats and mice, which is another long-standing anti-Semitic association. Moreover, the film contains a scene in which Orlok arrives at the fictional German town of Weisburg via a ship and brings with him a swarm of rats who go on to spread the plague. So this again draws on the anti-Semitic tradition associating Jews with plague and disease. And we can think, for example, of the stories of blood libel that accused Jews of intentionally poisoning wells. Nosferatu has been hailed as a cinematic masterpiece, and it remains incredibly influential within horror cinema today. Some people have stated that any anti-Semitic tropes within the film were probably unintentional. And Kevin Jackson notes that Murnau, who was himself gay, was friendly with and protective of a number of Jewish men and women throughout his life. However, I think it's important to note that whether intentional or not, these anti-Semitic tropes are present within the film, and perhaps more insidious because they are not explicitly acknowledged. However, Der Golem, another German silent horror film, is explicitly anti-Semitic. Der Golem, or The Golem, How He Came into the World, is actually the third installment of 3 films made by Paul Wegener about the Golem, but is the only one that survives today. This film is based on the Jewish legend of the Golem, in which the Jewish community, and specifically a rabbi who is skilled in the mystical art of Kabbalah, makes a creature out of clay to protect them from violent anti-Semitic attacks. It also takes inspiration from the 1915 novel by Jewish writer Gustav Meyrink, also called Der Golem. However, this is not a film written by and for Jews, but rather a film constructed by non-Jews that takes this legend and transforms it into a horror story about the Jewish other. The characters of the rabbi and the rabbi's daughter are largely anti-Semitic caricatures. Kabbalah is reduced to occult magic, and the violence enacted by the Golem shows the horror of Jewish monsters. This film and the other in Wegener's series were made at a time where fascism was on the rise in Germany, and Jewish communities were a particular conduit for social anxieties and fears. In 1933, when the Nazi Party had come to power, theatre companies were shut down and many actors and directors were arrested, persecuted, or exiled. Not Wegener. In fact, Wegener went on to become an actor of the state and even starred in several Nazi propaganda films. So, despite this entangled history, and again, that image of the Dybbuk I think is also interesting in the ways that Christian narratives attach themselves to Jewish narratives, the Golem is probably the best known figure of Jewish folklore today, and a classic example of early silent horror film. This film inspired parts of Universal's 1931 Frankenstein film, solidifying the connections between the Golem and Frankenstein's creature as both being man-made monsters. And more recently, a cartoon version of this specific version of the Golem appeared in The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode in a segment titled, You Gotta Know When to Golem. So, however, there are also early examples of horror films made by Jews. So in 1937, Der Dybbuk was released. And this is a Yiddish language Polish fantasy film based on the earlier play by Jewish author S. Ansky. The plot centers on a young bride who is possessed by the spirit of a Dybbuk on her wedding day. And although it was made in the style of German Expressionism, it is distinctly different from Nosferatu and Der Golem in that it is made by Jews for Jews. Which brings us to the final part of this talk, the rise of Jewish horror in the 21st century. So I should probably start by explaining what I mean by Jewish horror, I'm talking specifically about works that are created by Jewish people. That can be writers or directors, or films where there is a substantial creative input from Jewish communities, and also where the work focuses on Jewish characters and topics and themes important to Jewish communities. So this is not other people making stories about Jews, but rather Jews telling stories themselves. The horror is therefore quite different to Christian constructions of the monstrous Jewish other in blood libel myths, anti-Semitic traditions, and other examples within literature and film. Another question you might be asking is, why now, and why not in the previous century? And I'm still working on this question, so please do let me know if you have any thoughts on this. But to be honest, I think, like many things in the 20th century, it comes back to the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. So about 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, which at the time was about 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. And many more were displaced across the world. So essentially, for many Jews, life was itself a horror story. And of course, just because the Holocaust is over doesn't mean that the horror story has come to an end. A film that I think captures this is a short film by Shawn Wainstein called Demon Box. I saw this short film last year at a film festival, and I rewatched it for this talk, and I can say that every time I've watched it, it has made me both laugh and cry. This film is about telling stories about the Holocaust, and specifically the intergenerational trauma that comes with having stories passed down through families from survivors. It is an intensely personal autobiographic film that also touches on themes of suicide, and it does so through the relationship between a boy and his grandfather. The boy is haunted by demons born out of his grandfather's past, and in particular by a Nazi stormtrooper. There's also a zombie deer. As Shawn states, of course the kid would be afraid. Of course you wouldn't think you could stand up to Nazis. I think I make films that I can unpack things and finally look inside and discover what it is I'm trying to say. It's still a process for me. It's hard to be brave and really hard to be honest, which is probably why I use an animatronic zombie deer creature instead of confronting it directly. This film also provides possible answers to the question, why now? So at the start of the film, a commentary track states, this movie has been rejected from about a dozen film festivals. So originally the film was edited as a traditional film, but following these rejections, Shawn revised the film and added a commentary track, transforming it into, quote, a painful, blunt, and funny dissection of the film and his life, end quote. In this commentary track, we gain insight into Shawn and his family, what it's like to be a filmmaker casting Nazis. So, for example, Shawn says, when I was casting Nazis, you find these people who are a little too into the role, which I think is a little bit horrific. We also learn a little bit about what it's like to be a Jewish filmmaker. As Shawn says, as a Jewish filmmaker, you don't want to just make Holocaust films. That's not a thing you want to do. I generally avoid any type of Jewish content. And I don't know if that's because of the idea of like trying to hide your identity to survive. I think that Demon Box is hauntingly beautiful. And it is part of a larger wave of Jewish horror in the 21st century. So this includes some mainstream horror films that you might have heard of. So The Unborn is a 2009 horror film about Dybbuk. This film also foregrounds Holocaust trauma through the Dybbuk, which was created during the horrific experiments conducted by Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele on twins. A few years later, in 2012, we have another Dybbuk film, The Possession, which is a Jewish twist on both the possession film, but also the genre of horror that is based on a true story, as you can see on the poster there. This century has also seen a rise of Israeli horror. So I'll just briefly mention the Paz brothers here, but I want to point out that there are other people making horror in Israel too. So Doron and Yoav Paz are brothers and Israeli filmmakers. On the left, you can see them standing next to the poster for their 2015 film, Jerusalem. This is a found footage horror film of the apocalypse, and it's shot entirely through the perspective of Google Glasses. And on the right is the poster for their next horror film, The Golem, which came out in 2018. This film is basically reconstitutes the figure of the Golem back into a Jewish narrative. I really love this film because it's essentially a period horror. So if you like The Witch, you'll probably like this film too, although it is very, very violent, just as a kind of disclaimer there. As well as being a tale about anti-Semitic persecution in 17th century Lithuania, it reimagines the golem figure into a child. The Paz brothers have described the golem as being the Jewish Frankenstein and being like a Jewish superhero. And they also say that the golem stories are well known in Israel, and we think every kid knows about it in some way or another. We didn't grow up in an Orthodox house, but this story about a giant monster who saves the Jews and their enemies, it blew our minds. I think it's really interesting to consider this film in comparison to the 1920 Der Golem. And I have talked about both of these films elsewhere, but if you want to hear more about them, then please do ask me in the question portion. And this cycle of Jewish horror is still ongoing. So recently we've had films like The Vigil, which I'll talk about a bit more, but also Blood Relatives and Attachment, both of which came out last year. So Blood Relatives is a Jewish vampire film in which vampire Francis, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, discovers that he has a daughter and she's also a vampire. So the film is very much about their family journey. And then returning to Dybbuk's, we have the Danish film Attachment. And what makes this film really interesting is that it's also a queer love story. So if queer horror romance is your thing, then do check this one out. In the final part of this talk, however, what I want to do is focus on The Vigil, which came out in 2019. So The Vigil opens with these words. For thousands of years, religious Jews have practiced the ritual of the vigil. When a member of the community dies, the body is watched round the clock in shifts by a shomer or watchman, who recites the psalms to comfort the deceased soul and protect it from unseen evil. This watchman is typically a family member or friend, but there are paid shomers, hired to sit the vigil when no one else can. So written and directed by Keith Thomas, The Vigil is steeped in Jewish law, theology, and demonology. IndieWire has described the film as being like The Conjuring with an Orthodox Jewish twist, but I want to argue that The Vigil is not simply a Jewish version of The Conjuring or The Exorcist. This is not a Christian tale of salvation and vanquishing demons, but a Jewish one of moving forward in a personal journey of grief. So following the death of Holocaust survivor Reuben Litvak, the Hasidic Jewish community of Brooklyn turned to Yaakov Ronen to assume the role of shomer for the night. Yaakov has actually left the Orthodox community, and he's approached by a rabbi from his former community after a meeting of similar individuals who have disaffiliated. The group share their experiences and troubles as they try to acculturate themselves to modern America beyond a closed religious group. And they discuss getting to grips with technology like smartphones, the need for classes about how to write a resume, and for the women, their adjustment to sexual harassment on the streets. Some of the men wear a kippah or a yarmulke, which is the skull cap worn by Orthodox Jewish men in public, and the group switch seamlessly from English to Yiddish. And so this is not about these individuals no longer being Jewish, but simply their choice to move away from a specific religious group. Yaakov shares that his main worry is money and a lack of employment. And he also reveals that he is struggling and having to choose between medication and meals. The rabbi's offer of performing the role of shomer thus offers him an opportunity. Before leaving the Orthodox community, Yaakov was an experienced shomer, and now that he's outside of the community, he negotiates a payment of $400 for the night's work. So money necessitates Yaakov's return into the heart of Orthodox Judaism. And Keith Thomas has described that this journey was also experienced by him and many of the people working on the film. It was important to Thomas that the film be as authentic as possible, and as well as not filming on the Sabbath and providing kosher food, they also hired advisors to help make the set authentically Hasidic. The house in which the vigil takes place was in fact previously owned by an elderly Jewish woman who had passed away a few months before. And as well as keeping much of her decor and items like rugs and furniture, the producers made sure that religious items like mezuzahs were not just placed around the house, but placed there properly and in keeping with Jewish practices. So mezuzahs are small scrolls affixed to the doorpost of doorways in Jewish homes that contain passages from scripture. And although items like these are not prominent or even necessarily captured on film, we can see that care has gone into representing not just an Orthodox home, but an Orthodox community. As during the film, we see the rabbis touching the mezuzah as they enter the house. So later, in Mrs. Litvak's bedroom, we see her mirror covered up, which again reflects a traditional Jewish custom. Houses of mourning are full of evil spirits who want to fill the emptiness left by an individual's death. And so mirrors are covered to ensure that those who are mourning do not have to see them. Throughout his vigil, Yaakov witnesses and is at times besieged by the memories and trauma of Mr. Litvak. Remembering and re-experiencing his own trauma, he also discovers that a mazik demon has been haunting Mr. Litvak and is now seeking a new broken person to hold in its clutches. But what exactly is a mazik? So firstly, we have to turn to the Talmud, which is one of the central texts within Judaism and the source of Jewish religious law and theology. And you might be thinking, isn't the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible just a version of what Christianity refers to as the Old Testament? And the answer is no. I'm not going to go through everything on the screen here because I don't have time, but this is just to illustrate how many different components there are to Jewish religious texts. So on the one hand, you have the Tanakh, which is separated into 3 different groupings. And here you might recognize some of the books, such as Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms. You'll also notice the Talmud, which is essentially a collection of writings or 63 tractates that contain the teachings and elucidations of thousands of rabbis, essentially discussing and talking through ideas and verses within the Tanakh. Rabbi Jeffrey W. Dennis is probably the best academic to thoroughly discuss mazik demons or mazikim, to give them their plural name. Writing in the Encyclopedia of Jewish Myth, Magic and Mysticism, he says that the Talmud in particular is the best and most extensive source for Jewish demonology. Although, of course, it can be difficult to track down because it is scattered across all of the different tractates, as well as commentaries on the Talmud, like Rashi, who was a medieval French rabbi. So within Judaism, the existence of demons are, to some extent, widely accepted, although they do present some theological difficulties. So in some instances, demons are interpreted as fallen angels or the offspring of angels and humans. Sometimes they are viewed as beings born between the days of creation. And in other instances, they are seen as the byproducts of humans. In all cases, however, demons are, like humans, created by God. And as such, they have a purpose in the world. So Dennis acknowledges that mazikim are relatively uncommon in the Talmud compared to other demons like Shadim or the demon Lilith, but they do appear in tractates like the Berachot, as well as Jewish mystical texts like the Zohar. In the Middle Ages, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud also popularized the term. So mazik means damager, and Rashi often used mazik interchangeably with imps, which led to the creation of images like the one you see on screen now. Today, mazikim are relatively unknown, even within the small but growing field of Jewish horror. However, choosing mazikim as the film's demon also allows Thomas to do something new, and it gives him a lot of scope to create a demon that resonates with and represents the key themes of his film, trauma and grief. So, as we can see on the screen here, these are some examples of Thomas's mazik. For much of the visual, we do not actually see the demon, and when we do, we glimpse only a blurry figure in the distance, like the top image, or we see parts of the demon. We also learn that the mazik doesn't have a face, and instead is always looking backwards with its head turned around. This is not then an impish figure, but rather a large, ominous entity with long talon-like fingers. So in the bottom image, we see the mazik start to grasp a young Mr. Litvak. And this is Mr. Litvak believes when the mazik first got a hold of him. Awakened by Mr. Litvak's pain, he later reveals that the mazik followed him home. So this memory is from Buchenwald, a Nazi concentration camp in Germany, surrounded by a forest known as the Screaming Forest, because the scores of victims tortured and murdered here were so intense and horrific. Mr. Litvak's story is but one small glimpse into a history of specifically anti-Semitic horror. And I think it's important to remember that an estimated 56,545 people died in this one camp, while many more were injured and traumatized. Represented by the Mazik demon that he brings with him to America, for Mr. Litvak, this is trauma that never left him. His pain fed both his grief and the Mazik. And Mrs. Litvak says that she often wonders what my poor Reuben would have become. The other image we can see on screen is a FaceTime between Yaakov and his friend Sarah, where it appears that the Mazik has Sarah in its grasp. There is a lot that happens in this film where it's up to you to work out if it's real or not. But what's clear in this sequence is that the Mazik is essentially playing with Yaakov. And not only is the Mazik feeding on Mr. Litvak's trauma, but it is starting to prey on Yaakov's trauma too. So Yaakov suffers from PTSD as a result of the death of his brother Burek. And just as we see Mr. Litvak's memories throughout the vigil, we also see flashbacks from Yaakov's perspective. So the brothers were surrounded by a group of men on the street who taunt their Orthodox dress and use anti-Semitic slurs. But as Burek escapes from the grip of these men, he runs into traffic and is hit by a car. The Mazik uses the body of Mr. Litvak and Yaakov's phone to play the role of Burek, pleading with Yaakov in a haunting child's voice, "Why did you let me die?" So again, through Yaakov, we have one small glimpse into contemporary acts of violent anti-Semitism and the trauma caused by such events. This then is not a traditional demon. The Mazik has roots in Jewish scripture and demonology, and in this film is also inextricably linked to the Jewish experience of trauma, grief, and anti-Semitism, which leads us to the question of how do you protect yourself from a Mazik once it has ensnared you? So apotropaics are things that we use to ward off evil and protect us from things like demons or vampires. Within a framework of Christianity and Christian horror, demons and other monsters traditionally respond to overt appeals to Christianity and often specifically Catholicism, whether that be through prayers and the recitation of religious rites, the arrival of religious leaders such as priests or other individuals, and also the use of objects such as rosary beads, crucifixions, and holy water. So we can see these apotropaics in action in the classic example of The Exorcist, and more recently in the Conjuring universe. So here, for example, on the left, we can see Father Merrin holding a Bible as he is enlisted to exorcise a demon. And on the right is Ed Warren in The Conjuring 2, who performs exorcisms with the covert authority of the Catholic Church. And here he's using a cross to ward off evil. But of course, these religious leaders and items would have no power or authority within a Jewish framework. So let's turn to Judaism. Lilith is probably the best known Jewish demon that has her own name, and as a result, she has her own specific apotropaic methods. Here we can see an incantation bowl warding off a female demon, and there are similar bowls for Lilith, as well as amulets. Of course, Mazikim are a different kind of demon, so these items probably wouldn't have any effect on Maziks anyway. If we return to the Talmud, however, we find passages highlighting the importance of the Shema. So this prayer, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," is said 3 times a day, and some consider it to be the most important prayer within Judaism, while Berakot 5a:5 outlines its use against evil. So to quote, "And Rabbi Yitzhak said, 'Anyone who recites Shema upon his bed, demons will stay away from him.'" This prayer then might be of use against the Mazik, and we'll come back to this in a minute. Turning to films, we can also see the importance of rabbis and other specific Jewish items. So on the left is an image from The Possession, where a rabbi recites scripture to protect a young girl from a dybbuk before securing the dybbuk in a box. And on the right, in The Golem, we can see that the use of the shofar temporarily halts the action of a golem. But in his film, Thomas does something slightly different. So early on in the film, we see a shot of the rabbi waiting for Yaakov that recalls the iconic shot from The Exorcist. In that film, the priest as exorcist is fundamental to the removal of the demon. Conversely, however, the vigil signals a move away from this, providing an everyday practice that any Jewish person can perform. It's not a rabbi who fights the Mazik, but Yaakov. Before facing the Mazik, Yaakov is shown putting on tefillin, which consists of 2 black boxes containing scrolls of parchment with scripture written on them with straps. The boxes are placed on the forehead and on the non-dominant arm, and they're wrapped around the head and the hand and draped over the shoulders. The tefillin serves as a reminder of God's intervention during the exile of Jews from Exodus, and wearing them is a way to devote yourself to the righteousness and not to evil. In an interview with Isaac Feldberg, Thomas talks about the importance of the tefillin in this moment, saying, "It came from that place close to Evil Dead 2, with Ash putting that chainsaw on his arm. It's a classic archetypal scene of facing the thing that frightens you, and everyone loves that drumbeat moment of armoring up. From there, I asked, well, what is it? What's the Jewish version of the priest's crucifix? And I realized I'd never seen in a film anyone putting on tefillin and face a demon in the hallway. So I asked some rabbi if that was kosher, if you could put on tefillin and face a demon. And they were like, sure, 100%, that'd help. So, armed with the tefillin and repeating the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," Yaakov faces the Mazik and eventually commands it to let the body and soul of Mr. Litvak go and be at peace. The demon also allows him to leave the house in the morning when the vigil is over, but not unscathed. So as he arranges to meet his friends for coffee, he clutches his hand and ribs because they were injured during the vigil. And like his trauma, he will continue to carry these pains with him. Along with these injuries, however, Yaakov has tools to aid him in his personal struggle. The final shot of the film reveals a blurry, shadowy figure in the background. I know these images aren't very clear, but it's also not very clear in the film. It's intentionally blurry. It is intentionally unclear as to what this figure is, whether it is the Mazik, perhaps still attached to Yaakov, but at a distance, or perhaps seeking a new person to possess in its clutches. What is clear, though, is that, like the Mazik, memories and experiences and trauma cannot be vanquished, but continually grappled with to move towards peace and uplift. As the group counselor says at the start, this is a journey, and being here, struggling the way you are, is only one stop on that journey. What matters is when moving forward. So yeah, thanks for listening. These are some ways that you can contact me, and yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk about this more. But yeah, thank you.